Under the blistering New Mexico sun, the dry earth shimmered with heat as Rachel Morris adjusted the weight of the iron rod slung over her shoulder. Her welding mask hung loosely in her left hand, and her boots crunched against the gravel leading up to the modest but spacious property she'd bought less than a year ago. There was nothing extravagant about the house, just a single-story adobe structure with a wide porch, thick clay-colored walls, and a creaky wind vane shaped like a horse that spun lazily on the roof whenever the desert wind kicked up. But to Rachel, it was everything. It wasn't just a place to live. It was a line drawn in the sand after years of chaos and compromise. It was the first thing that was truly hers. No strings attached. After a drawn-out divorce, a collapsing business partnership in Phoenix, and a long list of burned bridges, both personal and professional, Rachel had come to this edge-of-nowhere property not to hide, but to reclaim her space, physically, emotionally, and otherwise. The land had once been a working ranch, or so she'd heard. Some of the structures still stood, an old barn, a rusted-out grain silo, even a collapsed chicken coop, but nature had reclaimed most of it. It took her weeks to clear out the invasive mesquite, haul away truckloads of decayed lumber and abandoned farm gear, and finally make the place livable again. The house itself needed reinforcement, especially around the beams and roof, and Rachel, never one to outsource what she could do with her own hands, took to it like it was her personal resurrection project. Welding during the day, planning at night, surviving off takeout and an endless rotation of old metal albums and black coffee, she slowly transformed the dilapidated estate into a functioning home and workspace. The backyard was now cleared and leveled. The well had been tested and restored, and the barn had been converted into a metal studio where she produced custom gates, industrial art pieces, and restoration parts for antique vehicles. A niche market, but profitable and, most importantly, fully hers. She kept to herself not out of bitterness but clarity. Rachel had learned the hard way that being too generous with her energy and time came with a price. That didn't mean she was rude. She waved to neighbors when she saw them at the local co-op, exchanged pleasantries when she picked up packages at the small-town post office, and even brought over a handmade iron welcome sign to the local cafe in a gesture of goodwill. But Rachel didn't host barbecues or attend potlucks, and she certainly didn't volunteer for any community committees. Her boundaries were clear, and her solitude wasn't a retreat from the world but a declaration that she had earned peace, and she was going to defend it. The first time she met Karen Livingston, it was in late March. The wind had started picking up that day, dry and sharp, carrying the scent of wild sage and creosote through the valley. Rachel was in the barn studio, grinding down a metal sculpture commissioned by a local winery, when the motion sensor near her front gate sent a buzz to her phone. She'd installed the system herself. 2 cameras, motion-activated floodlights, and a steel gate with a keypad lock. A simple setup, but one that had proven reliable. Checking the live feed, she saw a woman, older, impeccably dressed in beige linen with a floral scarf and a large straw tote, standing at the gate with a smile that Rachel instantly recognized as performative. She stepped outside, wiping sweat and metal dust from her face with the hem of her shirt, and approached the gate cautiously. Karen greeted her with exaggerated cheer. "You must be Rachel. I've been meaning to come say hello, but you know how time gets away from you." She chuckled, already opening the tote to reveal a tin of cookies and a folded cloth napkin, like some character out of a television show about suburban pleasantries. "I'm Karen. I live just down the hill. I wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood." Rachel, polite but guarded, took the tin and offered a half smile. "Thanks. That's thoughtful." Karen's gaze quickly shifted past Rachel to the backyard, her eyes scanning the cleared dirt, the refurbished barn, and the open space. My, you've done a lot. This place used to be a mess. I remember when the old owners let it all go. We were starting to worry that someone would just abandon it completely. But look at it now. It's practically a venue." Rachel's brow furrowed. A venue? Karen laughed lightly, waving a hand as though dismissing the word she herself had introduced. "Oh, don't mind me. I just meant, it's so spacious, so open. It's just the kind of place that would be perfect for a big event, like a wedding, or a charity auction even." Rachel nodded slowly, not committing to anything, and leaned her shoulder against the wooden post by the gate. "Well, I didn't fix it up for parties, just wanted a place where I could work and live without too much noise." "Oh, of course. I totally understand. It's just, spaces like these are rare. Back in the day, this place used to host some lovely summer gatherings. I even got married right over there." She pointed toward the far corner of Rachel's lot, where the old garden wall had crumbled into a pile of sun-bleached stone. "That's probably before your time, though. Anyway, you've done a beautiful job here. If you ever need a recommendation for a landscaper, I know a few great ones. This could be a real showpiece." The conversation lingered a few minutes longer, Karen talking, Rachel mostly nodding, and then, after an awkward goodbye, she watched the older woman walk away with her scarf flapping behind her like a flag of passive-aggressive diplomacy. Rachel didn't think much of it. Weird, maybe, a little too enthusiastic, but harmless. Over the next few weeks, Rachel noticed Karen more frequently, sometimes walking her small white dog along the edge of the property, sometimes pausing near the fence with other neighbors, gesturing animatedly. Once, she found a car parked outside the gate with its engine idling, the driver inside staring at the open land as if surveying it. When Rachel stepped out to confront them, the car pulled away. She began to feel, not watched exactly, but observed, as if her space, which she had so carefully reclaimed, was being quietly appraised by others. Still, she gave Karen the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it was just curiosity. People talked in small towns. She reminded herself that just because someone was nosy didn't mean they were malicious. Besides, she had her cameras, her alarms, and her own 2 hands. If something crossed the line, she'd deal with it. And then, one Thursday afternoon in late April, it happened. Rachel had just returned from the hardware store with supplies, paint, welding rods, replacement bulbs for the motion lights, when she noticed a flatbed truck rolling away from her property. There were tire marks across her gravel path, new ones that hadn't been there when she left 2 hours earlier. She parked her truck, stepped out, and immediately felt it. A shift in the air, a weight pressing down on her chest. The backyard, her clean, flat, hard-earned stretch of earth, was no longer empty. Rows of folding chairs sat in neat arcs across the ground. A white pergola stood where her tool bench had been, decorated with fabric that flapped in the wind like sails. Tables lined the perimeter, some still half covered in plastic wrap. Extension cords ran like vines toward a massive sound system covered in tarps. And standing at the far end, clipboard in hand and phone to her ear, was Karen Livingston. Rachel didn't need to hear a word to understand what was happening. The stage wasn't being set. It had already been decided. Karen spotted Rachel almost immediately, though she made no move to approach her at first. Instead, she turned slightly, said something into her phone with an animated laugh, then ended the call and tucked the device neatly into her handbag. Rachel stood there in silence, her hands hanging stiffly at her sides, trying to suppress the rising adrenaline that made her chest tighten. It wasn't just that things had been brought onto her property without permission. It wasn't even that someone had installed an entire wedding setup like this was a rental venue. It was the way Karen stood there, fully relaxed, like she was hosting a backyard barbecue at her own home. That galling, detached comfort, as if this were normal. Karen finally walked over, her heels crunching against the gravel. Her smile was polite, but underneath it was something that Rachel couldn't quite name. Dismissiveness, perhaps. Confidence built on the assumption that she couldn't be challenged. "Oh, there you are. I was wondering when you'd get back. You really must have had quite the shopping day, huh?" Her voice was light, airy, as if nothing out of the ordinary were happening. Rachel didn't return the smile. "What the hell is this, Karen?" Karen blinked innocently. "This? Oh, just a little setup for Mandy's big day. My niece, remember? I thought I'd mentioned it. She's getting married Saturday. We couldn't find anywhere nice enough in town, and then it hit me. Your place. It's just perfect." Rachel's expression didn't change. She didn't blink. "You thought my private property would be perfect for a wedding?" Karen clutched her hands together as if praying for patience. "Well, yes, but don't make it sound so harsh. Oh, it's just one afternoon. We'll be in and out before you know it. You won't even notice. Everything's already taken care of. Chairs, tables, catering, the music. I've coordinated it all." "You coordinated it all without asking," Rachel said slowly, each word deliberate. "You entered my property, brought in trucks, installed a stage, and ran power cables, without so much as a call or a note?" Karen's expression faltered for just a second, the edges of her smile tightening. "I tried to ask, but you've been busy. Hard to catch. And really, Rachel, you didn't exactly say no when we talked about it a few weeks ago. You just said it wasn't for parties. And this isn't a party. It's a ceremony, a family gathering, a tradition." "I didn't say yes, either," Rachel replied, voice now flat and cold. "You can't just assume that my home is available because you couldn't get a reservation elsewhere." Karen drew in a breath, clearly deciding whether to escalate or retreat. "Listen," she said finally, "I understand your hesitation, but let's be reasonable. Everything's already here. If we take it all down now, we'll lose deposits, upset the caterers, throw everything into chaos. I've got people flying in from 2 states. There's a string quartet coming tomorrow, and this isn't just about me. It's about Mandy. She's had such a hard year, and this is supposed to be her moment." Rachel crossed her arms. "You should have thought about that before setting it up on land that doesn't belong to you." Karen's mouth tightened again. "I'm just trying to create something beautiful for one day. It's not like we're moving in. It's a few hours. You don't even have to be here. Just give us some space and we'll be out before sunset." Rachel looked around. The cords, the rented furniture, the archway built exactly where her forge cart normally stood, and then turned back to Karen. "You have 1 hour to get all of this off my property. After that, I start dismantling it myself." Karen's polite mask finally cracked. Her smile dropped, her brow furrowed, and her jaw tensed. "Rachel, don't be unreasonable. You really want to ruin someone's wedding over a technicality? We're neighbors. Community means give and take." "This isn't a community," Rachel snapped. "This is my home, my land, my rules. And you didn't ask. You invaded. You want to talk about being neighbors? Try showing basic respect." Karen stared at her for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "Fine. If you're really going to make a scene about this, I'll talk to the vendors. But I can't promise they'll be happy. You may be hearing from some of them directly." She turned on her heel and walked briskly toward the stage, raising her voice to address one of the crew members. Rachel didn't stay to listen. She turned and walked back toward the house, every step heavier than the last. Once inside, she locked the door, drew the blinds, and leaned against the wall, her palms pressed against the cool plaster. The air inside the house was still, but her thoughts weren't. Every moment played back in her head. Karen's casual tone, her gall, the implicit message that Rachel's silence had been taken as permission. Rachel had always known Karen had a knack for charm mixed with manipulation, but she hadn't expected something this blatant. She sat down at her kitchen table, pulled out her phone, and began making calls. First to the sheriff's department. The dispatcher was courteous but non-committal. "Ma'am, unless there's active damage or trespassing at the time of the call, this is a civil matter. You'd need to file a formal complaint with the county or seek a restraining order if it continues. You can certainly document everything, though. Photos, videos, statements, and submit that if you choose to press charges. Rachel thanked them curtly and hung up. Next, she called the property insurance company. The representative took her report, logged the situation, and gave her a clear warning. If there's an event hosted on your property without a written agreement and something goes wrong, someone gets injured or there's damage, you could still be held liable. Our recommendation? Prevent the event from happening entirely. Then came her lawyer, an efficient man named Aaron, who had helped with the property purchase. He listened carefully and asked for time-stamped photos of the setup, a written summary of the encounter, and any security footage. "You've got a solid trespass case," he said, "but you need to act before the event occurs. Once people arrive, it becomes harder to control the narrative. Document everything, and if possible, get a written notice of revocation into Karen's hands before the weekend. Deliver it in person or by courier. That way, there's no ambiguity." Rachel spent the next hour compiling evidence, photographs from every angle, security camera footage, a map of the property lines with her signature, and the newly drafted cease and desist letter her lawyer had emailed her. Then she printed the letter, signed it, and walked it back out to the yard. Karen was nowhere in sight now, but several workers remained. One of them, thin, tattooed, with a man bun and a clipboard, turned to look at her as she approached. "Can I help you?" Rachel handed him the envelope. "This is a formal notice to vacate the property. Any setup not removed by tomorrow morning will be considered abandoned, and I will handle it accordingly." The man looked at the envelope, then at her, unimpressed. "You'll handle it how, exactly?" "Whatever's necessary," Rachel said without raising her voice. "I don't think you want to find out." She turned and walked away before he could respond. Her heart was pounding, but her resolve was clear. This wasn't about being neighborly anymore. It was about sovereignty, about not being walked over by someone who mistook her silence for weakness. That night, as the desert air cooled and the wind rustled through the broken remains of the old garden wall, Rachel sat on her porch with her boots on the railing and a mug of strong tea cooling in her hand. She watched the distant glow of the work lights and heard faint voices drifting from the yard, but she didn't go down to check. She'd already made her move, and now she would see how far Karen was willing to push before understanding that some lines couldn't be crossed without consequences. By the time the sun had risen the next morning, the wedding setup was still in place. Not only had it not been dismantled, but additional decorations had appeared overnight. Floral garlands now wrapped around the pergola, white ribbons fluttered from the tops of the chairs, and fresh tire marks suggested more deliveries had been made. While Rachel slept, the generator hummed low and steady near the barn, and someone had placed a chalkboard sign at the front gate that read, "Private event, wedding in progress. Please respect the moment." Rachel stood at her kitchen window, watching as a man in a branded t-shirt and headset strode confidently across her yard, shouting instructions to someone near the driveway. They moved like they owned the place, like her earlier warnings had been part of some brief inconvenience they no longer had to acknowledge. Her cease and desist letter might as well have been confetti for all the respect it had garnered. She had expected pushback, even indifference, but this level of audacity bordered on something else entirely. It was defiance, a calculated risk on Karen's part, assuming that Rachel, faced with the scale of what had been set in motion, would back down, that she would choose social harmony over conflict, that she would opt for passivity to avoid the public ugliness of being labeled difficult. Karen wasn't just using her property. She was daring Rachel to do something about it. Rachel didn't hesitate. She stepped away from the window, picked up her phone, and dialed her lawyer. Aaron answered on the second ring, his voice tight from a morning still in motion. "Let me guess, they're still there?" "They've doubled down," Rachel said. "More equipment, more people. They've added signs now, like this is officially theirs." He didn't sound surprised. Then it's time for the next move. I'll file an emergency order with the county clerk. It may not go through before the weekend, but it'll establish a paper trail for future action. Meanwhile, if you have private security contacts, now's the time to get them involved." Rachel had been waiting for him to say that. She'd avoided it the day before, hoping to resolve things without escalation, but the situation had changed. She called a security firm in Albuquerque that she'd once hired during an installation project for a museum. They specialized in property control and event management, highly discreet, highly effective, and not cheap. Within 3 hours, 2 black SUVs rolled up her driveway and deployed 4 uniformed professionals, each carrying radios and sidearms with body cameras clipped to their vests. They didn't say much, just nodded, confirmed the property lines with Rachel, and began politely but firmly confronting the people on site. The first vendor who was approached, one of the catering staff unloading crates of glassware, tried to argue that Karen had signed all the contracts. "She told us she had the place for the weekend, paid the deposit and everything. If you've got a problem, take it up with her." But when the security officer asked to see the contract and pointed out the name on the address, Rachel Morris, private residence, no venue license, the man stopped unpacking. One by one, vendors began to pull back, hesitating to set up anything else without confirmation. Some made calls, others began quietly packing up their gear. But not all of them. The DJ's crew refused to budge, claiming they'd been promised full payment only upon setup. One of them even went so far as to call Rachel uptight under his breath as he coiled wires on the grass. Karen arrived an hour later. She came not through the front gate but down the slope from her own property, cutting across the field like a general surveying her battlefield. She was dressed in a pearl-white pantsuit and low heels, sunglasses perched on her head, and carried a clipboard she didn't consult once. As she approached, she smiled at the security team as though they were waitstaff, then made a beeline for Rachel. "I was hoping we could avoid this," she said before Rachel could speak. "There's no need for muscle, Rachel. That's just going to make people uncomfortable." "They've already made me uncomfortable," Rachel replied evenly. "So we're even." Karen sighed, feigning disappointment. "Listen, I understand you're upset, but at this point, it's too late to cancel. The guests are flying in tonight. Mandy's dress is being delivered this afternoon. If we move the location now, it'll destroy everything. This is her wedding, Rachel, not some tailgate party. It's sacred." "Sacred doesn't mean uninvited," Rachel said. "This isn't a compromise, Karen. This is theft. You've stolen access to my home." Karen's lips tightened. "You think this is going to play well with the community? When people hear that you bulldozed a wedding for a girl who lost her father last year? You think they're going to see you as the principled landowner or the bitter neighbor who's out for revenge?" Rachel didn't flinch. "You're the one who thought you could get away with this, that people like me wouldn't push back." The conversation might have gone further, but one of the security guards approached. "Ms. Morris, we have a situation near the equipment shed. One of the contractors has refused to vacate. He's claiming Karen Livingston gave him written access." Rachel looked to Karen. "Is that true?" Karen looked caught for a second, then recovered. "Well, I may have written an informal access letter for the power hookups, just to make sure everything ran smoothly." "You forged my permission," Rachel said, her voice low. "It's not forgery," Karen snapped, now visibly irritated. "It's practicality. You were being unreasonable. Someone had to make sure things got done." Rachel's lawyer would later explain that the letter, while not a formal contract, could constitute misrepresentation or even fraud under certain interpretations. But Rachel didn't need legal terminology to understand what had just happened. Karen had moved from entitled to criminal. That night, Rachel stood at the edge of her property, watching as a few remaining lights glowed faintly near the stage. The security team had established a visible perimeter and were walking shifts. But the tension hadn't faded. It had only evolved. Karen had left the yard earlier in the afternoon, red-faced and tight-lipped, but Rachel knew she wasn't done. People like Karen didn't take defeat quietly. They circled back, changed tactics, and came at you again from another angle. Rachel tried to rest that evening but couldn't sleep. Her phone buzzed periodically. Texts from Aaron with updates about the court filing, automated alerts from her security system, even a call from one of the vendors who was now demanding reimbursement for the canceled job. At midnight, she stepped outside for air and walked the perimeter with a flashlight, scanning for any movement. It was then she saw the drone. It buzzed faintly above the treetops, a little red dot blinking against the dark. Someone was flying it along the fence line, dipping occasionally toward the barn, then pulling back. It hovered for a full minute before zipping off into the sky, disappearing as quickly as it came. Rachel cursed under her breath and made a mental note to add anti-drone signage to her gate the next day. The escalation didn't stop there. The next morning, Rachel found her mailbox open and filled with wedding brochures. Dozens of them, all addressed to the venue at Sunridge. Someone had added her property to public registries as an event space. A few clicks on her phone confirmed it. Her address was now listed on 3 different wedding planning websites, complete with photographs someone must have taken from outside her fence. It wasn't just an invasion anymore. It was a full campaign. Rachel spent that day speaking to her insurance agent again, clarifying the limits of her liability, issuing takedown notices to the websites, and photographing everything, mailbox included. She filed a new report with the county, updating her claim to include reputational harm and unauthorized promotion. And as the sun dipped low, she walked the edge of her yard again, this time with a clear sense of what had to happen next. They weren't going to leave on their own. Karen had made that abundantly clear. She was banking on fatigue, on public pressure, on the natural human tendency to avoid confrontation at all costs. But Rachel had no more energy to spare for pretending. The event was still scheduled for Saturday. The guests would begin arriving tomorrow night. And when they did, there wouldn't be a stage waiting for them. There wouldn't be chairs or tables or decorations fluttering in the breeze. Because Rachel had already made the call. She had secured the equipment, the operator was booked, the contract signed, and the timeline set. At 5:30 a.m., on Saturday morning, a bulldozer would roll through her gate, and anything still standing would be reduced to dust. By Friday afternoon, the tension that had been simmering all week began to shift from quiet hostility into something more volatile, like a storm preparing to breach the edge of the horizon. Rachel had barely slept the night before, her thoughts spiraling around logistics, legality, and the sheer audacity of what she was up against. There was a thin line between stubbornness and conviction, and Rachel knew she was walking it with boots made of concrete. But there was no turning back now, not after everything that had been said and done, and certainly not with Karen doubling down every hour. The morning had been uneventful on the surface. The security team remained posted along the perimeter, but Karen's crew had resumed their activities as if nothing had changed. Several rental trucks had arrived with more supplies, chairs, lights, decorative lanterns, even a floral arch made of iron that Rachel instantly recognized as being designed by a competitor she had trained years ago. It struck her like an insult dressed as a compliment. She watched from the porch as delivery people unpacked boxes with the confidence of those who believed they were on the right side of the law. When one of the security guards approached them with a request to leave the property, a tall man in a navy polo shirt simply pointed toward the nearby slope where Karen stood in full view, holding her phone up, filming the exchange. She made no attempt to intervene or acknowledge Rachel. Aaron had warned her that this would happen. She's building a paper trail of her own now, he had said earlier that morning during a brief call. Trying to make it look like you're the aggressor, the one interfering with a peaceful event. Stay calm. Stick to the documentation. Do not, under any circumstances, lay a finger on anyone or anything until the deadline hits. That deadline, Saturday morning at 5:30 a.m., loomed like a guillotine in her mind, every tick of the clock another inch closer to impact. But Rachel had made one final attempt to resolve things before the blade dropped. That afternoon, she requested a formal mediation through a local neutral party, an older man named Paul Reyes who'd spent decades resolving property disputes throughout the county. She didn't expect it to work, but it was a legal checkbox, one more sign that she had exhausted every civil option. The meeting was held in her barn studio, which had been temporarily cleared and set with 2 folding chairs and a small table. Karen arrived 15 minutes late, dressed in another pastel ensemble that seemed designed to project softness, though the tension in her jaw told a different story. Paul, calm and measured, opened the conversation with a review of the facts, then asked both parties to speak. Karen went first. She spoke of her niece's difficult year, of emotional stress, of family support, of tradition. She framed the wedding as a local celebration and herself as someone simply trying to preserve joy in a world full of cynicism. She referred to Rachel's refusal as rigid, her tone as hostile, and her recent actions as intimidating. When Paul asked her directly if she had secured written permission to use the property, Karen dodged the question twice before finally admitting she had not. But I truly believed Rachel understood the spirit of what we were doing. I thought there was a shared understanding. Rachel said very little in response. She simply slid the printed photos across the table. Karen's forged access letter, the drone sighting screenshots, the wedding registry pages using her home's name, and, finally, the cease and desist letter time-stamped and delivered 2 full days, before the bulk of the setup. Oh, Paul nodded slowly, the weight of the evidence sinking in with each image. He turned to Karen. At this point, the most I can recommend is a rapid dismantling before morning. Otherwise, Ms. Morris will be within her rights to treat this as an abandoned illegal encampment. Karen said nothing. Her eyes flicked down at the papers, then back at Rachel. So, this is how it ends, she said finally. After everything we've tried to build here as a community, this is the legacy you want? To be the woman who tore down a wedding? Rachel met her gaze without blinking. Better that than be the woman who stole someone's home and called it a gift. With that, Karen stood and left without shaking hands. By dusk, it was clear she had no intention of complying. Lights went up again along the stage. A small team began testing the sound system, and several guests started to arrive early, suitcases in tow. Rachel watched them from her front window, unsuspecting, dressed in semi-formal attire, some even carrying gifts. One group wandered into her garden, mistaking it for a reception area. A young girl leaned over her water trough and plucked a flower from a cactus arrangement Rachel had been cultivating for months. It wasn't malice. They simply didn't know. Karen hadn't told them. Rachel stepped outside briefly and approached one of the new arrivals. A man in his 50s with a kind face and a suitcase that looked far too expensive for the terrain. "You lost?" she asked calmly. "No, just early," he said cheerfully. "Karen told us we could get settled in before the rehearsal dinner. The tents are around back, right?" Rachel smiled politely. "This isn't a venue. This is my home." The man paused, visibly confused. But Karen said, "I know what she said," Rachel cut in gently. But she was wrong. He looked back toward the slope, uncertain. "I guess I should talk to someone." "You should," Rachel agreed, then turned and walked away. That night she sat on the porch with her boots up and a thermos of coffee that had long since gone cold. The security team rotated shifts. The generators hummed. Music played softly near the stage, muffled by distance but still present. The air was heavy with desert stillness, broken only by the occasional whoop of a barn owl or the distant bark of a coyote. Rachel sat without speaking, without thinking much. The plans had been made, the timeline set. Tomorrow morning would come, and with it, the end of this farce. Around midnight, another drone buzzed by. This time it hovered closer, as if daring her to react. She didn't. Let them watch. Let them collect whatever footage they thought would paint her as unreasonable. They'd see soon enough that sometimes doing the right thing looked like doing the hard thing. And sometimes doing the hard thing looked like a bulldozer rolling across a wedding altar at sunrise. The morning sun had not yet fully risen when Rachel stood barefoot on the hardwood floor of her living room, a mug of coffee going cold in her hands as she stared out the window at the silhouettes moving across her land. Despite the previous day's mediation, despite the presence of the security team, and despite the legal threats, Karen had chosen to escalate the situation in the only direction left, by leaning into chaos. By the time Rachel stepped outside, her boots firm on the gravel path, she could already hear the echo of voices, the metallic thud of poles being hammered into the soil, the laughter of oblivious guests, and the occasional blare of car horns from vehicles arriving in a steady stream. A line of SUVs and sedans stretched along the property's edge, most of them double-parked, some already leaking passengers in suits and dresses. Folding chairs had been reinstalled overnight in defiance of her written order. The pergola, though partially dismantled during the prior day's confrontation, had been crudely repaired and redecorated. One of Karen's nephews, judging by the matching family facial features, stood confidently on a stepladder attaching strands of lights to a wooden crossbeam. They weren't retreating. They were rushing the finish line. Rachel crossed her yard without speaking to anyone, her stride deliberate and her face unreadable. The security team watched her silently, having already documented several incidents that morning, including one where a groomsman had attempted to physically remove one of the guards. That man had been gently restrained, spoken to, and escorted off the property without police involvement, but the tension was thick and growing. At the edge of the makeshift seating area, she found Karen directing vendors with a clipboard in one hand and a coffee in the other, her pastel shawl fluttering slightly in the warm desert wind. Rachel stepped into her line of sight and stopped, saying nothing. Karen looked up, smiled tightly, and held her arms out. "You're just in time. We're doing the final sound check. Couldn't find the power junction you mentioned yesterday, but we improvised." Rachel stared at her, unmoved. "You had your chance. You chose this. You've got 1 hour. After that, I won't be asking again." Karen lowered her arms, her smile faltering for just a moment before she regained composure. "Rachel, listen to me. These people flew in from Michigan, Colorado, even as far as Maine. I've already paid for the catering. My sister took a personal loan to cover the photographer. This isn't just about me. This is about a family, about love. This is about theft," Rachel said. "You're not going to cry on a pile of furniture you stole and expect me to feel sorry for you." Karen's expression darkened. "You've made your point. You've embarrassed me. You got your little legal notes and your guards in tactical vests. Congratulations. But now we're here, and if you touch one thing, one chair, one light bulb, I will make sure you regret it. You think you've won? You've just started a war." Rachel didn't blink. "Then let's finish it." She turned and walked back to the house, ignoring the stares of confused guests, the murmurs and half-heard comments about being the owner or the crazy woman. She didn't respond when someone from the catering staff asked where they could plug in a cooler. She moved through it all like a ghost, focused only on the countdown in her mind. 53 minutes, 52, 51. Inside, she placed a single call to the contractor who had delivered the bulldozer the night before. He answered with a groggy voice but snapped to attention as she calmly confirmed the plan was green-lit. The machine had been parked in her workshop overnight, tarp-covered and fueled. By contract, the operator was permitted to begin removal of unauthorized structures at any time after 6:30 a.m. At 6 a.m., Rachel personally unlocked the barn and pulled the tarp free. The metal glinted in the growing light. The operator, a quiet, broad-shouldered man named Eli, climbed into the cab and started the engine without a word. It roared to life with a guttural churn. The noise spread instantly across the property like a warning shot. Heads turned. Conversations paused. Karen's niece, tall, blonde, and visibly stressed, appeared near the altar and walked quickly toward the sound. Karen shouted something inaudible and began rushing through the rows of chairs. Rachel stayed clear of the machine's path, her hands at her sides, her security team spread in a perimeter. Eli maneuvered the bulldozer with surgical precision. The first structure to fall was the lattice archway, which had been hastily resecured with zip ties and ribbon. It cracked and splintered, falling sideways in a puff of dust and silk petals. A gasp rippled through the guests as they realized this wasn't a bluff. This was execution. One by one, the chairs were crushed beneath the treads. The table, with the seating chart, the stacked boxes of champagne flutes, the portable sound mixer, all reduced to debris. Karen was screaming now, trying to be heard over the engine. "You're insane. This is a felony. You can't do this. I'll have you arrested." Rachel didn't respond. She didn't need to. Everything had been documented, all warnings issued, all deadlines missed. The photographer's assistant attempted to run forward to retrieve a tripod, only to be intercepted by one of the guards who calmly held up a hand and pointed to the property boundary. Guests began filing back toward their cars, confusion turning to frustration and disbelief. A woman in heels nearly fell while stepping over a crushed extension cord. Someone started crying. By the time the bulldozer had cleared the altar platform and reversed out of the central yard, the space resembled a disaster site. Splintered wood, tangled wires, and shredded fabric littered the area. The only things left untouched were the surrounding plants and Rachel's perimeter lighting, which the operator had carefully avoided. Eli stepped out of the cab, nodded to Rachel, and walked to his truck. He didn't wait for applause. Karen stood in the middle of the wreckage, her face pale with rage. Her niece was crying now, surrounded by two bridesmaids and a man holding his phone like a weapon. "You'll pay for this," Karen hissed. "I swear to God, I will sue you into oblivion." Rachel walked up to her slowly, her voice low and even. "You're welcome to try. But let me be clear, this was never about you. This was about drawing a line and keeping it. You ignored every warning, and you thought no one would stop you. Now you've learned otherwise." Karen opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. A deputy sheriff's cruiser had pulled up near the edge of the property. One of the guests must have called in a disturbance. The officer stepped out, surveyed the damage, and calmly approached. After a brief exchange with the security team and a quick glance at the paperwork Rachel provided, he turned to Karen. "Ma'am, were you given permission to use this property for an event?" Karen hesitated. I had a verbal agreement." The deputy raised an eyebrow. "Was that agreement in writing?" "No, but—" "Then I'd advise you to leave immediately. This is private land. Continuing to occupy it could result in charges. Do you understand?" Karen nodded stiffly, her hands clenched at her sides. The deputy waited until she turned and began walking away. Then he tipped his hat slightly toward Rachel and returned to his vehicle. The cleanup took hours. Some guests stayed to help Karen gather what little could be salvaged. Others left in silence, uncomfortable and shocked. The catering staff refused to unload the food. The photographer packed up without taking a single formal shot. By midday, the property was empty again, save for a few tire marks and a few bruised patches of ground where chairs had once stood. Rachel spent the afternoon restoring order. She raked the yard, watered the crushed plants near the barn, and relocked the gates. The security team finished their final sweep, then quietly departed. No one spoke much. That evening, Rachel sat on her porch, legs stretched out, the wind brushing her skin like a cool hand. She watched the last of the sun fade over the horizon and breathed deeply. There was no joy in what she'd done, but there was peace. There was the undeniable, irreplaceable stillness of a boundary restored. Her land, her life, and her rules, enforced not with vengeance, but with resolve. In the week that followed the bulldozing, Rachel's world tilted into a strange, quiet war. Not a war of noise or movement, those had already peaked, but a colder, more insidious battle of perception, narrative, and consequence. She had braced herself for the backlash, but even her preparations could not blunt the relentless grind of community gossip, digital scrutiny, and the sudden appearance of strangers who knew her name, but not her story. Karen, as expected, wasted no time launching her offensive. By Sunday afternoon, a full 24 hours after the destroyed wedding, a dramatic Facebook post surfaced with a carefully cropped photo of the bulldozer mid-demolition and a caption that read, "My niece's wedding was destroyed by our neighbor in an act of pure spite. We tried everything. We begged. We offered to pay. She brought in armed guards and flattened the altar just before the ceremony. Some people don't understand compassion. Some people are broken." The post went viral in their town and beyond. Local blogs reposted it. A regional talk radio host mentioned it in passing. Someone from Albuquerque messaged Rachel's business page pretending to be a potential customer before unloading a barrage of insults in the DMs. Strangers accused her of being heartless, unstable, a tyrant in steel-toe boots. But Rachel didn't break. She had expected exactly this kind of strategic victimhood. Karen hadn't just hoped for confrontation. She had been counting on the aftermath. She weaponized sympathy, manipulated imagery, and poured every ounce of her suburban grace into casting herself as the wronged woman besieged by a cold, unforgiving loner. What Karen didn't anticipate, however, was Rachel's own quiet, calculated pushback. Rachel didn't fight fire with fire. She responded with the cold weight of fact. Her lawyer sent takedown notices to the sites that reposted the false narrative using her name without permission. A carefully worded statement was published on Rachel's business page, which included screenshots of the cease and desist letter, time-stamped photos of the unauthorized setup, and a clear message. This property is not a public venue. No permission was given. All actions taken were within the legal rights of the property owner. This was not a dispute. This was trespassing. She posted no photos of the wreckage, no snide remarks, no name-calling. Her tone was unshakable, measured, irrefutable. Still, the damage had been done. A few clients canceled orders. One gallery in Santa Fe postponed a showing of her work, citing negative press. She received a handful of anonymous calls at odd hours, mostly silent, a few with muttered threats. And yet, for every attack, there came quiet support. A retired couple from 2 lots over left a pie on her porch with a note that read, "We know what she's like. You did the right thing." A welder from the next town over sent her a message offering studio space if things got too intense. Even Eli, the bulldozer operator, checked in with a simple, "Need anything else cleared? You know where to find me." These small gestures, these flickers of solidarity, steadied her. But Karen hadn't finished. Her next move came in the form of a legal notice, an intent to file a civil lawsuit for emotional distress, financial loss, and property damage. The documents were delivered via courier 3 days after the incident, pressed into Rachel's hand by a man in mirrored sunglasses who offered no words. She read them slowly, once at the kitchen table and again in bed, underlining key phrases with a red pen. Unjust destruction, reckless endangerment, intentional infliction. The nerve of it nearly made her laugh. Karen was suing for damages on property she never had permission to use. It was a bold, almost delusional move, but Rachel knew better than to underestimate bold delusion. It often played well in courtrooms and public sentiment. Aaron, her lawyer, responded with equal force. A counterclaim was prepared, citing trespassing, unauthorized commercial use of private property, and defamation. He walked Rachel through each step, assured her the law was firmly on her side, but reminded her that the courtroom was rarely about just facts. It was performance, persuasion, and patience. Rachel wasn't interested in theater, but she understood the stakes. She reviewed every document, compiled every photo, and agreed to a settlement strategy that made one thing very clear. She would not be shamed into silence. On the day of the court hearing's announcement, Karen tried one final maneuver. She showed up uninvited at Rachel's gate, standing just outside the keypad entry in a navy blue dress suit and holding what looked like a binder. The security cameras captured her arrival. Rachel watched from her studio window for a long moment before stepping outside, walking to the gate, and stopping 5 feet short of it. "I came to offer a resolution," Karen said, lifting the binder slightly. "There are documents in here. A mutual withdrawal of claims, a non-disclosure agreement, and a public apology draft that protects both our names. If we both sign, this goes away." Rachel folded her arms. "You want me to pretend this was mutual?" Karen's voice wavered, just slightly. "I want it to stop." The noise, the division, it's gotten ugly. Neither of us benefits from dragging this through court. "Some of us just want our property respected," Rachel replied. "Others want attention and control and applause." Karen's face hardened. "I didn't deserve what you did. You could have handled it differently." "I did handle it differently," Rachel said, stepping forward. "I asked, I warned, I offered legal mediation. You chose to turn my land into a stage and dared me to stop you. I did. And now you want a truce without accountability. That's not how this ends." Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She turned without another word, walked briskly to her car, and drove away. Rachel stood in the dust for a few more seconds, then returned to her workbench. That afternoon, she completed a commissioned gate panel, one she had been avoiding during the chaos. The piece was titled "Line Drawn." News of the upcoming court hearing spread through the community quickly. Local papers picked up on it. Karen gave a quiet interview to a lifestyle blogger known for romanticizing rural disputes. The piece painted her as a misjudged woman, seeking closure. Rachel declined all interviews but made one post before the silence, an image of her land, cleared and clean, with the caption, "Reclamation is not aggression. It's survival." The day before the court date, Rachel received a call from Aaron with a surprising update. Karen's legal team had proposed dropping the suit entirely in exchange for no countersuit, no media statement, and no financial settlement from either side. It was a quiet surrender dressed as compromise. Rachel considered it for a long time, sitting at the edge of her land, where the old altar had stood before being reduced to splinters. She remembered the sound of the bulldozer, the way her heart had thudded with each chair crushed, not from joy or rage, but from the certainty that she had passed the point of negotiation. She agreed, but with one condition: a formal written statement acknowledging that no permission had been granted for the use of the property and that all responsibility for the unauthorized event lay with the Livingston family. No accusations, no mockery, just fact, signed and notarized. It took 2 more days of negotiation, but the statement was eventually delivered, signed, and stamped. It would not be public. It would not undo the online rumors, but it would sit in her files like a quiet monument, proof that sometimes, when pushed past all reasonable limits, a person had the right to fight not just with restraint, but with clarity, and to win not with noise, but with control. Several weeks after the dust had settled, Rachel found herself standing at the edge of her land in the early evening light, the air still and golden as the sun dropped behind the distant ridge. The ground where the wedding setup had once stood was bare again, raked clean, the soil tamped flat, wild grasses just beginning to reclaim the disturbed earth. There were no chairs, no ribbons, no garlands, no laughter. Just the steady hum of cicadas and the soft rustling of wind through the mesquite. It was, once more, hers, quiet, undisturbed, free. The property had returned to the rhythm Rachel had always intended for it. Functional, open, peaceful. And for the first time since the conflict had begun, she could walk the perimeter without scanning for signs of intrusion. The gate stayed shut now, reinforced with a new locking system. The security cameras remained, not out of paranoia but pragmatism, and the studio was full again, not with noise, but with purpose. Orders were slowly picking back up. Word had spread among artists and collectors that Rachel Morris was not to be dismissed, not to be toyed with, and not to be shamed into submission. Her name no longer appeared in social posts about ruined weddings or petty feuds. Those voices had moved on, as they always did, hungry for fresher drama, louder scandals. What remained were the clients who respected her, the locals who nodded to her at the feed store, the few who had understood from the beginning that defending your land, truly defending it, wasn't cruelty. It was necessity. Karen had kept her distance since the legal truce. There were no more attempts at mediation, no fresh gossip, no thinly veiled provocations. Rachel suspected that behind the silence there was still resentment. That kind of ego didn't dissolve. It hardened in quiet corners. But Karen knew better now. Knew that Rachel wasn't bluffing. Knew that some fences were invisible but absolute. In town, when they crossed paths, there were no greetings, no eye contact. Just a mutual cold acknowledgement that the war had happened, and that one of them had lost. Rachel didn't savor it. She didn't even think of it as winning. All she had done was reclaim what was hers and refuse to apologize for protecting it. If there was satisfaction, it came not from victory but from the clarity of boundaries held and defended. She spent more time in her studio in the following months, throwing herself into work with a sharper focus. The conflict had forged something in her, a new layer of discipline, perhaps, or simply a deeper appreciation for control. Every weld, every cut, every arc of polished steel became a quiet assertion of autonomy. She took on a restoration project that required long hours and delicate precision, and she welcomed the challenge. At night, she sometimes walked the property line in the dark, not out of fear, but out of ritual, a confirmation that nothing had changed, that the silence held. It was during one of these walks that she saw something unexpected. Near the far edge of her land, just outside the fence, someone had placed a small wooden stake with a piece of ribbon tied to it. Red, subtle, easy to miss, but it hadn't been there the day before. Rachel approached slowly, her flashlight steady, and inspected it. It wasn't a survey marker, at least not an official one. There was no tag, no label, just the stake, the ribbon, and a subtle indentation in the soil where a boot had pressed. It was a message, perhaps. Or a test. She didn't remove it immediately. Instead, she took a photo, noted the coordinates, and flagged it for her lawyer. The next day, she installed a secondary motion-triggered camera aimed directly at that corner. Nothing happened for a week, then 2. The stake remained untouched, and then, just before the 3rd week ended, it vanished. No one was caught on camera. No vehicles, no movement. But it was gone. Rachel didn't report it. She didn't need to. Instead, she had that section of the fence reinforced, added gravel sensors to the ground, and posted a new sign at the edge. Private land. Entry prohibited. Violators will be prosecuted. It wasn't aggression. It was maintenance. One morning in early fall, a woman from the county office visited to inspect a building permit Rachel had applied for, a new storage shed for metalwork supplies. The woman, polite and professional, noted the improvements Rachel had made and casually asked about the wedding thing she'd heard about. Rachel simply replied, "Resolved." The woman nodded, jotted down a note, and said nothing more. That became Rachel's answer to all questions from then on. When old friends texted her to ask what really happened, when new clients hinted at the controversy they'd read online, when vendors chuckled and said, "So you're the bulldozer lady, huh?" She never indulged them, never elaborated. Resolved. That was all they got. And in that word, Rachel found freedom. The experience hadn't hardened her, not exactly. She still left pies on neighbors' porches when they were sick. She still offered help to stranded hikers who occasionally misread the trail maps. She still laughed when her goats managed to chew through garden fencing. But something in her had refined. She was no longer willing to explain herself for setting boundaries. No longer interested in softening the truth to make others more comfortable. Her land was her sanctuary. Her work, her life, her order. It had all been earned. She would not let anyone tell her it was negotiable. On the first anniversary of the incident, Rachel walked to the spot where the altar had once stood. There was no trace left now, not even a patch of disturbed soil. She stood there for a moment, looking at the horizon, and exhaled slowly. Then she turned and walked back to her home, the porch light glowing gently ahead like a quiet beacon. No noise, no apology, just the quiet rhythm of a life fully reclaimed.